So we're going to first take a look at the Korg M1. Now this came out in 1988, and so for me, the first synthesizers that I actually had experience with prior to the release of the M1 mainly was the big ones that were out were like the DX7 2FD, and of course the Roland D50, which came out in 1987. Of course, the DX7 2FD, I believe, was 86. And I remember going into the music store and looking at the Korg M1. And by the way, I had finally bought saved up enough bread to buy the DX7 2FD, which I really wanted the D50, by the way. It just the way the deals were at the time, and I barely had enough money. I think I had $1,100, and at that time they had demo units from the University of Michigan of the DX7 2FD, and so that's what I bought. But then just shortly after that, out comes the Korg M1, and I could have bit my tongue, because for me, the M1, while it doesn't sound like a D50, it had those qualities of sort of those airy sounds, like bottle bells, and it had the acoustic sounds, which neither one of those two synthesizers, DX7 or D50, could actually really do. And of course the sequencing, the onboard sequencer, which was a big seller, and so those of you that remember around that time, they had those sequences done by Don Mierno, if I'm pronouncing that right. Oh yeah, that's some really good sequences in it. So you can go on YouTube and listen to those, but they were very classic. And now, an interesting thing is that the time the Korg M1 came out was within that period of time when Yamaha bought the controlling shares of Korg, and so you would see a lot of cross-pollination of technologies and hardware and synthesis around that time and beyond. So, for example, you're going to see the same DX7 key bed that you find the DX7 2FD. You would find that in the Korg keyboards, starting with the M1, and then I believe all the way, getting a little ahead of myself, but all the way till the Korg Triton, and then that was it. Because I think Korg, the success they had with the M1, they were able to buy their shares back from Yamaha, take control. But you would see like the MOS technology and the MLAN cards and things like that would go back and forth between Yamaha and Korg, like the virtual acoustic, the VLM technology. I'm not quite sure who had what. Like the Korg have the MOS, the Yamaha have the VLM, but likewise, the Korg M1 was it. I do want to give a quick shout out to the Roland Fa76. It's a keyboard that I had contemplated on buying when it had been released, but by that time, it was kind of a failure on Roland, and they've done this a few times, by the way, in history, where they recycle their technology, and then another competing manufacturer will release something that's cutting edge. In this case, it was the first version of the Yamaha motif, which really, 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 as we know, set the history in all sorts of marks, and I'll get to that later. But the Roland Fa76 was really an expanded version from their XP50, XP60, XP80, and it really wasn't a workstation per se, because it didn't involve any kind of audio, so what it really was an XV5080 engine As a matter of fact, I contemplate that it was probably the XV5050, which is a little bit different than the 5080. Just a little bit. Remember the XV5080, you couldn't run the MFX, everything in serial. It was only parallel only. And so what you would find is that the engine in the FA76 workstation, some of those sounds were a lot different, like cold roads and so forth. The digi roads, I'm not saying that they were better, but they sounded different because you could route the effects differently, and it did make a small distinction. And I actually believe the sounds were actually, in my opinion, were in some cases were better than the 5080. However, you only had banks A through D on it, so that means you couldn't get the whole sound library from the 5080, the XV5080, not even the 3080. So it was almost like a special abbreviated library based off the XV5080. But otherwise, it was a very clean, non-Roland style design. It almost took on more of a Korg style design with the very slim line and I'm trying to think of the word, but clean look, kind of like an ONW where there's very little buttons. And so you found that the Roland way of doing things, such as the transpose button up and down, was a double function button that that was up below the four knobs. But like I said, the FA76 didn't go anywhere. Down the road, several years later, I had bought that. What we do is we buy things, sell them, buy them again, recapitulate, go back, and then buy it again. I probably had it maybe four times because of just the sentimental memory of how cool that particular board was, although it was a failure as a workstation. So we're looking at the Korg Triton, and Zach from Alamo Music is talking a little bit about it. He actually had the title about the Pro X being the ugliest and heaviest millennial icon. And the thing about the Triton was it was also one of the most expensive Pro synths back at that time. And but also want to mention that my personal feeling is that the Triton was one of the last workstations that had its own sonic identity. The sound sets were unique. You knew when you heard it on the radio that came from a Triton. Because since nowadays, especially workstations, are more, instead of creating new stuff, they really sort of, and I'll talk about the motif and all that whole line, because they often sort of ride on the history of past synthesis. And so there's a Triton studio right there in the background, but and the Triton actually had its own sound, is what I'm saying. Now the Triton, the first two Tritons, which was the studio and the original classic Triton, they were magnets for dirt. So you would put your hands on the buttons, and very often you'll see it's very difficult to find a Triton that doesn't have a dirty face on it, the panel. Now that would be alleviated a little bit down the road, because eventually they would they did a couple Triton LEs. One was silver and one was blue, and then of course they did the Triton Extreme, which was an amalgamation of all the Tritons prior to that, where it had all the PCM samples from the EXP cards that you used to have to buy separately. Those were very expensive, and you could put the MOS board in the Triton Extreme as well. Keep in mind, the MOS board that was available for the Trinity prior to the Triton was not the same board. It was an entirely different piece of hardware. But nevertheless, there's a Triton Extreme right there, blue. And so, and it had as you can see, the tube amp in the back, which made it in a few of the Korg synths following, like the SV1 and SV2. the AAX tube amp. But otherwise, the Triton Extreme would have been sort of the last hardware. It did resurface in a virtual model, not only just on the computer, but they had made a controller. I can't remember the name of it, but it was a controller, and you could actually option it out. This is way down the line though, and you could get the Triton presets in it. And then eventually, they recreated some of the classic presets that you could download for the Chronos and some of the workstations that were out then. The Korg Chrome out as well. You could get the presets, some of the popular presets. So that's the Korg Triton. So here's the Phantom S88, probably one of the first workstations since the W30 that really by defined with sequencing, synthesis, and audio. Okay, and the Phantom, this line of Phantom was designed to interface with the computer, transfer files back and forth, sample files, and all that, and still took the SRX cards from the past, but had a whole new sound set, and so they kind of departed a little bit from the XV JV series. And so forth and so on. They would eventually make a model after this because the Phantom S was a little restrictive in terms of the hardware they were using. But they came in two models, 61 and 88 keys. Now, the next model would be the Phantom X, and that was much more improved over the Phantom S. And it had a colored screen. It had different bus architecture, so they were using a compact flash medium for storing. This one could actually do not just the skip back sampling and the sampling in general, but it also did the SRX cards. You could hold 4 of them, which weren't restricted to the amount of RAM you had, by the way. That was a little bit different on that, how it addressed the cards. But it also had an upgrade that you had to pay for. Some had to pay for, which was the audio expansion kit, which allowed you to do 8 tracks of audio. My opinion, this Phantom was probably the most balanced Phantom out of all of them, all 3 of these. And I no longer have it anymore, but I've had it maybe 2 or 3 times in the past. And I tried not to get it again, but to me, out of all 3, this was the best one. Now, this was probably, depending on the position you take, but I think this was the worst one, the Phantom G. The best in terms of hardware. So this is when computing was real ubiquitous, and they were trying to push the lines on trying to become more of a computer alternative. So I understand where Roland was coming from. This was also a keyboard that tried to do to first introduce the supernatural technology. Now this was on a board, so it wasn't on the architecture itself, and it was real expensive expansion board. So here's the drum ARX expansion, which I still have that card, even though I don't own the Phantom anymore. And still today, this very, very impressive and forward-thinking the way you interfaced the Cosm technology or the supernatural technology. Whether Cosm and supernatural were the same thing, I don't know. But other than that, the Phantom G was just very disjointed, in my opinion, on how it addressed a lot of things, and the sounds were not all that amazing, and the sounds that I liked a lot were sounds that they carried over from the Phantom S and the Phantom G series. Like I said, they used the ARX expansion, so they no longer were compatible with the old SRX. And this might have been the last keyboard that Eric Persing did any kind of sound design on it. If I could be mistaken on that. But by this time, workstations were at all-time low because people were using computers. Pro Tools LE was like humongous around that time. And this is around that time I was talking about, sort of that all-time low of hardware where plugins were starting to rule the world and all that. So that's the Phantom series. Okay, the SY77, I'm going to talk a little bit about this before the motifs because it sets the groundwork from sort of their, not necessarily departure from FM, but there was a long drought from their DX7 2FD, and you got the while where Yamaha stopped making synthesizers for a while, and they were doing a lot of digital mixers, professional digital mixers and so forth, like the O2Rs and so forth, but that's why 77 was sort of a nice break back, and it competed with the T series. So we're talking about in the 90s, and it was only one model, and then they kind of went dry for a while, like I said. And then the EX5 comes out in 97, and that sort of almost becomes sort of the pre-motif. It had a lot of the VL technologies. It did not have FM in it, but it had the AWM technology, the analog, some aversion to it, built into the EX5. The EX7 did not have that. It was a 61 key keyboard. But it didn't take long. About 3 years later, Yamaha introduces I'll never forget this, on Harmony Central, the Motif 6. And I truly, everyone knows about it, but my perspective on it is that it really was the keyboard that killed Kurzweil. Kurzweil was sort of considered the BMW professional workstations, K2000, K2500, and all that. And Yamaha basically came out with the Kurzweil killer. Now, the plug-in architecture from their legacy technology, from their AN, their AWM, their FM, you could still get it as a plug board, but they were real expensive, and I suspect that it never really was successful marketing, at least. They would go through the Motif ES line, so this becomes sort of like the beginning of a long run, probably more successful than even the DX7. And Yamaha, the Motifs became a studio standard, eating the lunch of Korg and really Roland as well. I mean, Roland had the Phantom X's and so forth, but they could not compete with the mindshare of the Motifs. They would eventually come out with the XS, and of course the XF. Now, those two models were really close to one another, sort of like the Motif Classic as we know it and the ES. I still take the position that the original Motif and the ES had more of a thicker, wider sound, and the XS had more of a thinner sound. But nonetheless, I take the position on the whole Yamaha Motif line, as good as they were, and popular as they were, that the Motifs looking back, didn't have a defining sound like the previous workstations. And I didn't talk a lot about it in Sonic yet, but they didn't have the character like the older stuff, and that to me represents sort of the beginning of what I call the modern workstation, where it was sort of this generic, we're just gonna create some real generic stuff. Solid though. And then Yamaha, ran this run all the way up to 2016. So 2001 per se, I think, all the way to 2016. So it's a long run of dominance. I've owned all the Motif models in some form in the racks of the different models. The XS rack was the last rack that they had made, and eventually they would replace us with the Montage. And I won't talk a whole lot about the Montage right now, but that's Yamaha.